Welcome to the latest edition of the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I'm the sports editor here at the Herald Democrat, Jason Della Rosa, and we are about to enter the second to last week of the high school football season, the state semifinals, and there are two Texoma teams still alive chasing that championship trophy. We're going to get into this week's action. We'll look at last week's region finals and see how things are shaping up. There's only 4 teams left in each division, and we have Pottsboro and Gunter still alive chasing a championship. So we'll start in Class 3A Division 1. That's where we have the state semifinal game between Pottsboro and Brock. This game is a Thursday night game at 7:30 at the Star in Frisco. And the reason that they are playing on Thursday night is because the winner will play next Thursday at AT&T Stadium in Arlington at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So instead of playing on Friday like normal, the winner, regardless of who it is going to have an extra day of rest and have a full week between the games. And because it's an even earlier in the day game, you're basically wiping out a lot of stuff you can do on Wednesday because you're going to play so early on Thursday afternoon. And it also could be a slight advantage because the winner will be playing the winner of Grandview and Columbus. Those are the Region 3 and Region 4 teams, and that game is on Friday night. So I don't know how much of an advantage you can gain. It may only be a 3% advantage or a 4% advantage, but those two teams are going to play on Friday night as opposed to Thursday night, and you're talking a full extra 24 hours that either Pottsboro or Brock is going to have getting ready for that game. And also the interesting thing, of course, since they're playing on different nights, from a scouting standpoint, you're going to have the ability for each team to go and scout in person instead of if they were all playing on the same night. You could always send maybe 1 or 2 scouts or maybe no scouts at all, depending on how things were working out. So that could be an advantage either way, depending on how you want to scout. If you just want to look at film or actually go watch your opponent live. So Pottsboro got here with a thrilling 35-34 double overtime win against Gladewater, while Brock advanced with a 31-21 win against Pilot Point. That was, as we mentioned last week, that was an all-District 4 3A Division 1 matchup. Pottsboro is still undefeated at 14-0. I will point out there are only 12 undefeated teams left in the entire state from 6A down to 1A. Pottsboro is one of them, and Brock comes into the matchup at 12-2. To touch on last week's win over Gladewater, it was a very close game the whole way through. Obviously, you would think that with a double overtime win. We had a scoreless first quarter. A lot of turnovers kind of contributed to that being scoreless after the first quarter. Pottsboro took a 14-7 lead into halftime. The game was tied at 7, and in the last couple seconds before halftime, Zach Weidman caught a 2-yard touchdown pass from Braden Plyler to give Pottsboro the lead. Then the Cardinals had the only touchdown in the third quarter, so it's 21-7, 12 minutes left, in good shape, looking to advance. And then Gladewater showed what they were made of. They scored twice in the final 6.5 minutes. The last one with a little over a minute left, and they needed to get a 2-point conversion because it was 21-13 at that point. They had missed an extra a kick got blocked on the first touchdown of the fourth quarter. So they did that. We go to overtime. 2 plays into overtime, Gladewater scores. And then on the first play of Pottsboro's possession, they score, so we go to a second overtime. Pottsboro gets the ball first there. They have 4th and goal. Braden Plyler on the keeper from a yard out gives the Cardinals the lead. And then Gladewater scores on their possession, but instead of going to a third overtime, they decide to go for 2. And so in going for 2, that's the season. If you're Gladewater or Pottsboro, if you're Gladewater, you get it, you win. If you're Pottsboro, you don't stop it, you lose. And so Gladewater went with a rollout pass to the right, very well defended by Pottsboro. Jackson Lipscomb was able to kind of reverse field a little bit as he was chasing the quarterback towards the sideline, and it was able to knock down the pass, and that allowed Pottsboro to advance. Some of the numbers in that one, Plyler ran 20 times for 67 yards and a touchdown, and he was 11 of 17 passing for 242 yards and 3 touchdowns. Titus Lyons had 6 catches for 183 yards and 2 scores, and Cy Shope had 23 carries for 85 yards and a touchdown as well. If there was a bit of a concern for the Cardinals, they did allow over 500 yards. They gave up 253 yards rushing and 281 yards passing, including Elijah Carter, who had 24 carries for 184 yards and 2 scores. That's something that we're going to touch on here for sure with the preview with Brock. And it was one of those deals where a lot of it was Pottsboro was able to get this win because the defense was opportunistic and came up with some big plays when they needed to. Particularly Jason Hooker, who had an interception in the end zone on Gladewater's first drive of the night when they put together, trying to put together a good response after forcing a turnover on Pottsboro's possession. Stopping a fourth down attempt on Pottsboro's first possession. He also recovered a fumble that Tyler Ferris caused on a long pass that would have set up Gladewater about 1st and goal at the 7. Ferris knocked the ball loose, and Hooker was right there to jump on it. And a third time where it looked like Gladewater was going to be on the verge of scoring. They had 1st and goal, and they had to settle for a field goal try. I think it was 34 yards, and it was a wide kick to the right, a little bit short too. So that was 3 possessions. You're talking potentially 21 points, minimum maybe 17 points, and Gladewater was unable to come away with anything there. So the Pottsboro defense was able to rise to the occasion when they had to. They did the same thing the week before. They had to stop Malakoff after taking the lead with about 36 seconds left. So that was a good sign there. To get to Brock and this week's matchup, you have a team that this is kind of all they really do. So Pottsboro is trying to get to the championship game for the first time in school history. The only other time the Cardinals have been this far was in 2008, and they lost in the semifinals. They finished 13-2 that year. So by winning their 14th game, Pottsboro set the school record for wins in a season. For Brock, this is the 3rd straight season that they're in the semifinals, and the 4th time in 5 years. They were the state champion in 2017. So you have some kids, the senior class. They may not have been big contributors, some of them, but they were sophomores the last time that the program won a championship. So their kids are really used to this. This is, and that's going to be the interesting thing. Coach Poe said that he wasn't too worried about it, especially with the games that they've played the last couple weeks. They've been so close and very, very high stress kind of situations. The fact that Pottsboro is here for the first time in a long time for these kids, not making that big of a deal. But there is something to it if you're a senior at Brock. This is kind of, you do this every year. You're expected to go this far. You won the region against a team that had beaten you. You get some revenge there. So it'll be interesting. The other interesting thing about Brock is they play a lot of close games. So we talked about Pottsboro the last 2 weeks. They've had 2 games decided by a total of 8 points. 7 of Brock's games, half of their games, have been decided by 10 points or less, including last week. So they've been involved in a lot of games where they've had to win late. Even in district play we mentioned. So they lost a Pilot Point, and that was a game that was 20-14 in the district opener actually, and then the other game that they lost was 10-0 against Brownwood in the season opener. But then you talk about, they lost 21-7 to Iowa Park. We mentioned before that, that was a good team out west. They beat Liberty Christian, Argyle Liberty Christian by 7. In district play also they had to beat Boyd 13-6 and Paradise 24-22 back-to-back weeks to be able to get the second spot for the playoffs, to get the runner-up spot in the district. And then in the playoffs, they beat Bushland 20-17, and then last week they won by 10, 31-21. So they've had a bunch of close games. They've had, you don't want to say they could easily be a 500 team. But they've got two losses. They could easily have 4 or 5 just based on some of those scores. And they are a running team. Last week, Cash Jones had 37 carries for 221 yards. They are a ball control team. And I couldn't find his total number of carries for the season. Obviously, we're about to enter game 15. Jones was averaged 22 carries a game in the regular season. I wasn't able to get all the totals for the games in the playoffs, but he's their workhorse. Last week, obviously, you get to this point in the season, give a guy 37 carries. I don't know what the point is of where you might wear a guy down type of a thing. So it'll be interesting to see how they do that. If they do get anything in the passing game, a lot of it's going to be off play action. That's what they did last week against Pilot Point. So that will be interesting. And then, like we said, of course, just the stakes of this game. This is the play for a championship, and when you're dealing with kids, you never know how that's going to affect things. To touch on Brock's defense, the most points that they have allowed so far this season, is 22 points. Nobody has scored more than 22 points against Brock. They've held a bunch of opponents either to single digits or in a shutout. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They've held half their opponents to single digits or shut them out. So that's a situation where if Pottsboro can get to 4 touchdowns, that's a major win. And so this could be a defensive slugfest type of a game if Brock has their way, and this does turn into one of those games where every possession, they're grinding 4 or 5 minutes off the clock and keeping Pottsboro's offense, which is the most successful offense in school history. They need one more point to get to 650 points on the year, by far blowing away the old record. They're now 124 points ahead of the 2015 team in that regard. The next game is the Class 3A Division II state semifinal between Gunter and Canadian. This is a familiar tale for these teams. They've met now for the 4th straight year in the state semifinals. Gunter got here by beating Holiday again in a rematch of the Region 2 final, 27-9, and Canadian did the same by beating Abernathy in a Region 1 rematch from last year, 35-31. So Gunter is sitting at 13-1. Of course, their only loss is to Pottsboro, so it's obviously a really good loss considering the Cardinals are doing what they're doing in the Division 1 bracket. And Canadian comes in undefeated at 14-0. This is a game that's at 7 p.m. on Friday at Vernon, so another long trip for the Tigers. After playing at Wichita Falls last week, they're going to head back out west and go to Vernon, which is where this game has been played before. There's not a lot of options between Gunter and Canadian, so they've kind of stuck to some of the same places, going to Vernon and Wichita Falls during this series each year. Last year in the semifinals, Canadian won 17-7 to advance to the title game and play Newton, and they finished as the state runner-up as Newton won back-to-back titles. Of course, Gunter is familiar with that because they were the winner of the game in 2018, 56-27, and then they ended up losing to Newton in the title game, and then in 2016, Gunter won that matchup 44-34, and that was on their way to the state championship, an undefeated season, 16-0 by the Tigers. So these teams are very familiar with each other. I don't think it's a really surprise to anybody that both of them are meeting again. I'm sure a lot of people picked that. I know a lot of people picked Canadian. I don't know if people thought Gunter was going to take a step back. But I think everybody kind of viewed that if this was going to happen, it wouldn't be that big of a shock. And so you have two teams that have been one of the best. Outside of Newton, they are probably the two best teams in 3A, at least in Division II, over the last 4 years. The senior classes. In the last 4 years, Gunter is 59-3. With a runner-up finish, a championship, and at minimum 2 other semifinal appearances. And Canadians, right there, they're 54-6 in this same span with the 4 trips to the semifinals. They've got a runner-up. The only thing they don't have is a championship. So they're trying to break through and pull that off. The winner of this game is going to play either Paul Pewitt or East Bernard in the championship game. East Bernard is in one of those teams that has gotten either to the region final or the semifinals the last couple of years, but obviously hasn't been able to get past Newton in their region because or they've made it to the semifinals and then lost to Newton because of the match there. I've seen Paul Pewitt. Obviously, we've talked about them. They knocked out Bells a couple of weeks ago. If I was picking an opponent for Gunter, not knowing a whole heck of a lot about East Bernard, I think they would want to play Paul Pewitt. Paul Pewitt's a run-based team, and Gunter just crushes the running attack for teams. So I think that would probably be the better matchup for them to go get that second title in 4 seasons. But that's obviously getting ahead of ourselves. They have to get past Canadian, and that's going to be a tough task. It's one of those games you kind of we talked about this with Gunter the last 3 weeks. They face Rogers, who's the team that knows what they like to do, and they know what Rogers likes to do. Last week you have Holiday, a team that they've played even more than Canadian these last couple of years because they're in district with them. They've played them 5 times in 3 years, and now you have Canadian, a team that you've faced in the semifinals the last 4 years. There's a lot of familiarity, a lot of knowing what people like to do or what they might do to you to take advantage of that. And so far, Gunter has passed the test. They were up 33-0 against Rogers, only allowed 14 points in a 47-14 win. Against Holiday last week, it was 27-9. Holiday in 4 of the 5 meetings has scored in single digits against Gunter. So Gunter has not allowed Holiday to do anything against them. The most points they've allowed in 5 meetings is 13. And so you have this Canadian matchup. The first 2 meetings, obviously, Canadians' offense was a little bit better against Gunter. Last year, they only scored 17. But they didn't need to because they were able to hold down Gunter, by holding them to 7 points, which is something that not a lot of people have done. So it'll be interesting to see if I'm looking at Canadian. I guess the biggest thing with them is they do have a different quarterback this year. The quarterback this year is Grant McCook. He was a receiver last year and was the 3rd leading receiver last year. So essentially the top 3 receivers from last year are gone because the top 2 graduated and McCook moved behind center. He's completing about 66% of his passes. He's thrown for a little over 2,500 yards with 26 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. He's also the 2nd leading rusher. He went over 1,000 yards last week. He's got 126 carries for 1,000 yards and 21 touchdowns. The leading rusher for Canadian is Hayes Huffstedler. He was kind of a 2nd option, maybe 3rd option last year. as a sophomore. He's got 161 carries for a little over 1,400 yards and 27 touchdowns. And the top, there's really not a main top receiver. I guess it would be Twister Kelton. He has 44 catches for 638 yards and 6 touchdowns. But you have two other guys who have combined have 11 touchdowns. There's 3 guys that have 26, 27, and 30 catches. 2 other guys have 19 and 15. And all those guys are pretty close in yardage, between 350 and 400 yards. So they do a really good job of spreading the ball around to the receivers. It's not just one guy. Last year it literally was basically one guy that they would go to try to get a majority of the yardage through the air. They've been putting up points. The 35 points that they scored last week, that was their lowest of the season. They did only score 36 points in the season opener. But if you just go week by week, the point totals are 42 points, 48 points, 54 points, 49 points, 57 points, 41 points, 57 points, 66, 46, 66, 49, 55. So they're going to put up points. And if there is a good thing, if you're Gunter and you're looking at that, outside of a stretch in non-district play where they had a couple of shutouts, some of the teams have shown they can score on Canadian. West Texas scored 22. Grapevine Faith Christian, which is probably the toughest game that they've played. Canadian won that one 49-35. 18 points, 17 points, 21 points. They beat Cisco in the region semifinals 55-28. And then last week the Abernathy game was close. It was 35-31. Abernathy got down, not big early, but Canadian basically led the whole way. They were able to get within a touchdown early in the fourth quarter, but just couldn't. About 8 minutes left, and they just couldn't get the next score to take the lead and put the pressure on them. Gunter's coming off. We mentioned the 27-9 victory against Holiday, and this was a game that I think it was a little bit of that. Familiarity breeds contempt, and probably breeds a close game. But it was another situation where just Gunter's defense, it continues to be, as good as it always is. We've harped on that fact, all season. It was another time this year where they held an opponent into single digits. That was I believe, it was the 9th time. 1, 2, 3. Yes, that was the 9th time this season in 14 games that an opponent was held to single digits. Dating back to their 31-27 win against City View. That's a span of 6 games. Nobody scored more than 14 points, and the only game that is under a 2-touchdown margin was the victory against Clifton, 27-14. Every other game has not been that close. And I mean, honestly, if you take out, out of all the wins, because obviously they lose to Pottsboro, they beat Dangerfield by 1 in the season opener, and they beat City View by 4 in district play. And outside of that, none of the other games are really all that close. It's at least a 2-touchdown lead. But that's what the Gunter defense does, especially like I said against the run. Holiday had 24 carries for 51 yards. They did throw for 175 yards, but it was kind of very big chunk plays because Holiday the passing was 7 completions for 22 attempts. There were three interceptions, 2 of those by Bryson Rigsby, and one of those passes was a 91-yard touchdown. That was actually the first score of the game, and the kick was blocked. So Gunter was down 6-0 about midway through the first quarter. But if you just take that play out, then you had six completions for 80-something yards. So there wasn't really a whole lot to to that passing game because so much of that came on the one touchdown play. And then outside of that, all Gunter allowed was a 42-yard field goal, which I mean that's in 3A. That's a pretty good kick. Early in the second quarter, and that was it. So Gunter was down 9-7 with about 9 minutes to go in the second quarter. They were up 14-9 at halftime, and then scored twice in the fourth quarter to extend that lead. Bryson Rigsby finished with 16 carries for 82 yards and 2 touchdowns. Peyton Lowe had 7 carries for 82 yards and a touchdown. Hudson Graham ran 15 times for 74 yards and the other score. And this was, Gunter had 50 carries for 307 yards, kind of grinding that game out. And like I said, shutting down Holiday from a defensive standpoint. Looking at this week, I think you can say this about any matchup. You can say this about Pottsboro Brock or Grandview Columbus or Paul Pewitt or East Bernard. Everybody's so good at this point. Everybody's records are really good. And I don't know how to handicap Gunter Canadian because the 3 previous matchups they've all been close. So at the very least, I would accept. I guess the middle game of the 3 that Gunter won was not as close. But 2 of the 3 games have definitely they finished with 10-point margins. Canadian knows they can win after the first 2. I think going into last year's matchup, a lot of people were like, "Oh, Gunter's just gonna beat them again," and Canadian was able to come away with that win. So I expect it to be another good game. I mean, all 3 of these games, like I said, they've been good games, and you have 2 programs that really have become the class of 3A over the cycle of this senior group. And so I would expect nothing less, especially with the trip to the championship game. That game would also be on 7 o'clock on Thursday, and so that would also set up a pretty amazing Texoma doubleheader if it were to happen. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that would love to see that happen. If Pottsboro and Gunter both win, they would play back to back in a doubleheader on Thursday. Pottsboro would play at 3, and then Gunter would play at 7. So that would be I couldn't even tell you the last time that, let alone that we would have 2 teams competing for a state championship on the same day. That would be a really fun thing to see how many people would go, not just Pottsboro and Gunter people, but just Texoma people in general get there and make a day of it to be able to watch the 2 teams, and spend 10 hours at AT&T Stadium to watch that. So we will see what happens. I will say again, we're at the point as long as teams keep winning, we will continue to do a podcast. So we will have one at minimum next week to recap these state semifinal games, and hopefully we have some state championship games to preview as well. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next week.